I've always had a thing for the paranormal. Not in the sense that I believed in it, at least, not really, but I always found it fascinating. Ghost stories, urban legends, haunted places. You know the type. It's easy to laugh at things like that when they're on a screen or confined to the pages of a book. But now, sitting in the dim light of my small apartment, it's hard to find any of that funny. Something happened to me that I still can't wrap my head around, and the more I try to explain it, the less sense it makes. But I need to tell someone. I need to get this out before I lose my mind. Maybe writing this down will help, or at least make me feel like I'm not losing my grip on reality. So here's what happened, what's still happening, I guess. It started like any other day. I remember it was a Wednesday, because that's when I had my late shift at the warehouse. My routine's pretty basic: wake up, hit the gym, grab some coffee, and then work until I can't feel my legs anymore. Then rinse and repeat. It's nothing glamorous, but it pays the bills. That morning, though, something felt off. I don't know how to explain it, but you ever have one of those days where everything feels wrong? Like you can't put your finger on it, but there's this low-level dread sitting in the pit of your stomach, making you uneasy. That's what it was like. The air felt heavy. The streets seemed quieter than usual. Even my coffee tasted bitter, like it was telling me I shouldn't go about my day. I tried shaking it off, blaming it on lack of sleep or stress, but as I was heading home from work that night, the feeling only got worse. It was a long, quiet walk back to my apartment. The streetlights flickered, casting weird shadows on the sidewalk, and for the first time in years I felt like someone was watching me. It was that gnawing sensation at the back of my neck, the one that makes you look over your shoulder every few steps. I chalked it up to paranoia. Who wouldn't, right? I figured I was just being ridiculous. By the time I made it to my apartment, I was tired enough that I didn't care anymore. I tossed my stuff on the floor, barely kicked off my shoes, and crashed on my bed. The second my head hit the pillow, I was out cold. When I woke up, that's when everything changed. It wasn't like a normal waking up. I didn't gradually drift into consciousness, rubbing my eyes and stretching my arms. No, this was different. I snapped awake, like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water over me. One minute I was dreaming something vague and formless I can't even remember, and the next, I was lying on something cold and hard. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, and when they did, I wished they hadn't. I wasn't in my bed. I wasn't in my apartment. I wasn't anywhere familiar at all. I was lying flat on my back in the middle of a goddamn graveyard. The shock hit me like a sledgehammer. I shot up, heart pounding, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I looked around, and there they were: tombstones, trees, a wrought iron fence in the distance. There was no mistaking it. Somehow I'd ended up in the middle of a cemetery. And it wasn't just any cemetery, it was the kind you only see in horror movies. The old kind. The creepy kind. My first instinct was to laugh. Like this had to be some kind of prank, right? Maybe some of the guys from work had spiked my drink, and I'd passed out somewhere. It's not like I'm a big drinker, but it could have happened, right? Except that didn't make sense. Why would I have woken up here? Why would they have dragged me into some graveyard in the middle of nowhere? I didn't remember anything from the night before. No bar, no wild party, just work and home. That was it. I stood up, my legs shaky, and took a few deep breaths. The cold air stung my lungs. It was dead quiet. No cars in the distance, no wind rustling through the trees, no animals scurrying in the underbrush. Just an eerie, oppressive silence that weighed on my chest. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant. Nothing. No response. I tried again, louder this time. "Hello." Still nothing. Just that damn silence. I decided then that I needed to get out of there, figure out where the hell I was, how I got there, and how to get home. I started walking, trying to orient myself, but the graveyard stretched on, further than it should have. The rows of tombstones seemed endless, all of them weathered and ancient, some tilted or half buried in the earth. There were mausoleums, too old, crumbling structures with rusted gates and dark, yawning entrances. I avoided them. Something about them made my skin crawl. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, hoping I'd at least have some service, but when I looked at the screen, it was dead. Not low on battery, just dead. I couldn't even turn it on. A pit formed in my stomach, and that feeling of unease I'd had earlier in the day came back with a vengeance. Something was seriously wrong. I don't know how long I wandered, but it felt like hours. The graveyard was a labyrinth, and every turn led to more gravestones, more trees, more fog. The fog had started rolling in thick by this point, swirling around my feet and making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. My head was pounding, and my breath came out in sharp, shallow bursts. Panic was setting in. That's when I heard the sound that would haunt me for the rest of the night. A soft, shuffling noise. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was the sound of something dragging itself across the ground. Something alive. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest, and strained my ears. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere behind me. Slowly I turned around. My eyes scanned the fog, searching for the source, but I couldn't see anything. Just gravestones and trees, the same as before. But the sound was there, getting louder, closer. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to move, backing away slowly. I didn't know what was out there, but every instinct I had told me I didn't want to find out. I needed to get out of that graveyard now. But the more I backed away, the louder the sound got. It was closer now, much closer. And then, through the fog, I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow and outline of something large and misshapen, dragging itself along the ground. It moved in a way that no living creature should, like its limbs were broken or twisted. The fog obscured most of it, but I could see enough to know it wasn't human, or at least not anymore. My body went cold with fear. I didn't wait to see what it was or how close it was getting. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the uneven ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, moving faster now, closing the distance between us. I ran blindly through the graveyard, stumbling over roots and tripping on loose stones. The fog was so thick that I could barely see where I was going, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that thing. The sound of its dragging footsteps echoed in my ears, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. I don't know how I found it, but eventually I stumbled upon an old, rusted gate. It was the first sign of an exit I'd seen since I woke up, and I sprinted toward it, my heart pounding with desperation. But when I reached the gate, I froze. Standing on the other side was a man at least. I think it was a man. He was tall, with long, dirty hair that hung in greasy strands around his face. His clothes were tattered and filthy, and his skin was pale, too pale, like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. He just stood there, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I didn't know what to do. The thing behind me was getting closer, but the man at the gate. Something about him terrified me even more. His eyes were hollow, empty, like he wasn't really there, like he was waiting for something. I backed away, my body trembling with fear. The thing behind me was almost on top of me now, but I couldn't move. I was trapped between two horrors, and I had no idea which was worse. Then, without warning, the man at the gate spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You need to leave." "I'm trying," I gasped, my voice shaking. "The gate, can you open it?" He shook his head slowly, his empty eyes still fixed on me. "It's too late," he said. "It's already here." I didn't understand what he meant until I felt the cold, clammy hand clamp down on my shoulder. I turned, and the last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was that thing, its hollow, empty eyes staring back at me, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. And then everything went black. It's been 3 days since I woke up in that graveyard, but I haven't been able to shake the feeling that I didn't leave everything behind. No matter how much I try to tell myself it was just a bad dream, just some kind of sleepwalking incident, there's something deep down that knows better. I haven't been the same since. At first I thought maybe it was sleep paralysis, some kind of vivid nightmare that felt real but wasn't. I mean, that would explain the feeling of being trapped, the shadowy figure, the weird sensation of waking up in a strange place. People get sleep paralysis all the time, but this was different. It wasn't just a dream. I didn't wake up in my bed. It wasn't like I jolted out of sleep and said, "Oh, thank God, it was just a nightmare." No, when I opened my eyes the next morning, I was still wearing my dirty clothes from the night before. My knee shoes were caked with mud. There were scratches on my hands and arms as if I'd actually been stumbling through the graveyard, brushing up against tree branch or falling on rough stones, and that pain in my shoulder at the spot where it had grabbed me was still there. A dull, The aching throbbed like a bruise that wouldn't go away. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like I'm still there, still in that graveyard, even when I'm here at home. That feeling of being watched, it hasn't left. I can't shake it. It's always there, lurking just at the edge of my awareness, a constant weight pressing down on my chest. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. That twisted figure, dragging itself through the fog, its hollow eyes fixed on me. And the man at the gate. His voice echoes in my head, that whispered warning, you shouldn't be here. It's already here. It's already here. But here's the worst part, the part that's driving me insane. It's not just the nightmares of the paranoia. It's not even the constant sense of dread that's been hanging over me like a dark cloud. It's the fact that things have started happening. Things that shouldn't be happening. The first sign was small, barely noticeable really. I was in my apartment trying to go about my day, trying to go pretend everything was normal. I was scrolling through my phone, just mindlessly killing time when I noticed the screen flickering. It wasn't a big deal at first, just a little glitch. But then it started getting worse. Apps would open and close on their own. Texts I hadn't sent would appear in my messages like random strings of letters or symbols. At one point I saw a name pop up in my contacts that I didn't recognize, Gates. I don't know why, but seeing that name made my blood run cold. I tried to delete it, but the phone froze. Then the screen went black. When it finally rebooted, the contact was gone, like it had never been there in the first place. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just some kind of glitch, but it didn't feel like one. It felt deliberate. The next thing that happened was even harder to explain. I'd come home late from work, exhausted, and I just wanted to take a shower and crash. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light. I mean, it had to be, right? But the more I stared, the more I realized that it wasn't just my imagination. My reflection wasn't moving. I blinked and it blinked too. But when I turned my head to the side, my reflection just stood there staring straight ahead, its eyes locked onto mine. I dropped the toothbrush, my heart pounding in my chest, and stumbled back against the wall. My reflection didn't move. It stayed there frozen, staring at me with this blank, hollow expression. And then it smiled. That grotesque, twisted grin, the same one I'd seen on the thing in the graveyard. The corners of its mouth stretched too wide, its teeth too sharp, too many of them. The next day I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again. Not just in the someone's behind you way, but like it was right there with me, just out of sight. I left the lights on in every room of my apartment. I didn't care if my electric bill would skyrocket, I needed the light. Darkness felt like a door, and I didn't want to know what might come through it. But light wasn't enough. Shadows started moving on their own. I'd catch glimpses of them out of the corner of my eye, long, twisted shapes, sliding along the walls, even when there was no one there to cast them. Sometimes they'd flicker like someone was walking past, but when I'd turn to look, the room would be empty. Then the whisper started. At first, I thought it was the TV or the radio, something playing in the background, but the sound wasn't coming from any speakers. It was coming from the walls. Soft, unintelligible murmurs like voices too faint to understand but too loud to ignore. They were everywhere behind me when I walked down the hallway, in the bathroom while I showered, even right next to my bed while I tried to sleep. They'd start as soon as I turned off the lights. Sometimes I'd hear laughter, faint and distant, like a child giggling. Other times it was just a soft hissing, like a breath that never quite made it into words. And the worst part, every time I heard the whispers, the air would get colder, like someone had opened a window in the dead of winter. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't matter. The voices were always there, waiting. A couple of nights ago, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and tried to leave my apartment, thinking maybe if I just got out for a while, things would settle down. When I didn't have a plan, just get in the car, drive, and keep driving until I was far away from whatever was happening. But as soon as I stepped up out of my apartment, I froze. There, standing in the hallway, was the man from the graveyard. The same dirty, tattered clothes, the same hollow eyes. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me, his head tilted slightly to the side like he was confused. Or maybe curious? My throat went dry, and for a moment I couldn't move. It felt like time had stopped. Then, slowly, the man lifted his hand and pointed toward the end of the hallway, toward the stairs. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to follow. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the stairs, even though every instinct I had screamed at me to run the other way. When I reached the top of the stairs, I looked down and my blood turned to ice. At the bottom of the stairs, crawling out of the shadows, was it? The same thing from the graveyard, the twisted, broken figure. It was dragging itself up the stairs toward me, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I bolted back into my apartment, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, deadbolted it, shoved furniture in front of it, anything to keep that thing out, but I knew it wouldn't matter. It was coming for me, just like before. Now I'm sitting here writing this down, hoping that if I get it all out, maybe it'll stop. Maybe someone will read this and know what to do. Because I don't. The whispers are getting louder. The shadows are moving again, and the temperature has dropped so much I can see my breath. It's coming. And this time I don't think I can run. But I've always heard people say that grief has a way of haunting you. They say it lingers in your chest, like a heavy stone you can't quite shake. But what if grief isn't the only thing that haunts you? What if it's something else? Something darker. Something far more real. It's been 6 months since my mom disappeared. I still remember the day like it was yesterday, burned into my brain with such intensity that I wake up most mornings thinking it's happening all over again. I remember her standing in the kitchen, making coffee like it was any other morning, her hair pulled back into a loose bun, still in her robe. I remember the smell of her perfume, floral, a bit too sweet for my taste, but comforting in that way that only things from your childhood can be. We didn't argue that morning. There was no big fight, no last words exchanged in anger. She wasn't sick or mentally unstable, nothing like that. 1 minute she was there and the next, she was gone. The police searched for weeks, combing through the woods behind our house, questioning neighbors, putting up missing posters. But there was nothing, not a single clue. It was like she had vanished into thin air. No one could explain it, and no one had any answers. Eventually the search was called off, and the world moved on. But I didn't. I couldn't. How could I when there was no explanation, no closure? I've been living in her house since she disappeared. It didn't feel right to leave. It's this small, creaky old place at the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods. The kind of house that always felt too quiet, too isolated, even before all this happened. Now it's unbearable. Every corner seems to hum with this oppressive silence, as if the walls themselves are waiting for something to happen. I'd hear footsteps upstairs, even though I was alone. The creak of the floorboards, soft at first, like someone was walking slowly, deliberately through the hallway. I'd go up there thinking maybe it was just the house settling, but there was always this faint, lingering scent of her perfume, floral and sickly sweet. The same perfume she always wore. At first I convinced myself that it was all in my head. Grief playing tricks on me, making me hear things, smell things that weren't there. I'd tell myself it was just the house, that I was losing it a little bit. But then things got worse. What was around the 3-month mark when I started seeing her. It wasn't like the stereotypical ghost you see in movies. She didn't appear in some dramatic way with flickering lights or cold gusts of wind. No, it was subtle. I'd catch glimpses of her in the mirror, just a flash of her face behind mine as I brushed my teeth or washed my hands. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then it kept happening. Every time I turned around, she was gone. But the more I looked, the more I started to feel her presence, like she was just out of reach, just on the other side of something I couldn't quite grasp. Then there was the kitchen, the one place that always felt like hers. Every morning I'd wake up and find things moved. The coffee pot would be turned on, or the cupboard doors would be open, even though I hadn't touched them. I'd come downstairs and the table would be set with one of her old mugs, the kind she loved. Sometimes I'd find her favorite tea steeping, just sitting there on the counter as if she was about to walk in and take a sip. At first I thought maybe it was my own doing, like I was sleepwalking or something, going through the motions out of habit. But then I started noticing other things that didn't make sense. There were messages written in condensation on the bathroom mirror, phrases like, "Where are you?" and "Come home." The handwriting was hers exactly as I remembered it. I tried to ignore it. I really did, but you can't ignore something like that forever. I tried telling myself it was stress, that it was all in my head, that I was imagining things because I missed her so much. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more frequent and more intense it became. One night I was lying in bed, unable to sleep. I'd been tossing and turning for hours when I heard the sound of someone walking upstairs. Slow, heavy footsteps, pacing back and forth. My heart was racing, and I knew I had to go up there, but I was frozen in place, staring at the ceiling. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was this deafening silence. Then the door to my bedroom creaked open. I sat up so fast I felt dizzy. There, standing in the doorway, was my mom. She wasn't the same as I remembered, though. Her face was pale, almost sickly, and her eyes looked wrong. Too wide, too empty, like she was staring straight through me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. She stood there for what felt like hours, just watching me. Then, slowly, she turned and walked back down the hallway. I followed her, but by the time I reached the door, she was gone. Things escalated quickly after that. I started hearing her voice, not the soft, comforting voice I remembered from childhood, but a low, distorted version of it. Sometimes it would call my name, soft at first, like she was whispering in my ear. Other times, it would be more aggressive, almost like she was yelling from another room. No matter where I was in the house, I'd hear it. I'd hear her. One night, I was in the kitchen trying to eat something when I felt this overwhelming urge to turn around. There, standing in the doorway, was her shadow. It wasn't her, not exactly. It was more like a silhouette. A dark figure standing perfectly still, just watching me. My hand started to shake and I dropped the plate I was holding. It shattered on the floor, but I couldn't look away from her shadow. It didn't move, didn't react, just stood there. Then, slowly, it began to fade until there was nothing left. I barely slept after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see her face not the way I remembered her, but the pale, gaunt version that had appeared in my bedroom that night. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to suck the light out of the room, and her mouth was twisted into this unnatural, grotesque smile. I tried to get out of the house. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and drove to a motel on the other side of town. I thought maybe if I left for a while, things would go back to normal. But they didn't. On the first night at the motel, I woke up to the sound of knocking on the door. It was loud and insistent, like someone was banging on it with their fists. I opened the door, but no one was there. The hallway was empty. But as soon as I closed the door, I heard her voice again. "Where are you?" It was faint at first, like it was coming from somewhere far away, but then it got louder, closer, until it felt like she was standing right next to me, whispering in my ear. "Come home." And I came back to the house the next day. I didn't want to, but it felt like I didn't have a choice. There was this pull, like something was dragging me back. As soon as I walked through the door, I knew I'd made a mistake. The air inside the house was heavy, thick with this oppressive weight that pressed down on my chest. I could barely breathe. That night I heard her again, but this time it wasn't just her voice, it was her voice. This low guttural sound that didn't sound like her at all. It echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls until it felt like it was coming from every direction at once. I ran upstairs thinking maybe I'd finally lost it, that I was imagining all of this. But when I reached the top of the stairs, I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her back to me. Her hair was matted, tangled, and she was wearing the same robe she'd had on the day she disappeared. I called out to her, my voice barely a whisper. "Mom?" She didn't turn around. She didn't move at all. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw it. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was floating, just a few inches above the floor, her body perfectly still, like she was suspended by invisible strings. I backed away, my hand shaking, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. Slowly, she began to turn, her head twisting in a natural angle until she was facing me. Her eyes were gone, just empty black sockets where they used to be. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. She took a step toward me, her movement slow and deliberate, like she was savoring every second. I turned and ran, slamming the bedroom door behind me, but it didn't matter. I could still hear her. Her footsteps echoing in the hallway, getting closer and closer. That was the last night I spent in the house. I moved out the next morning, leaving everything behind. I couldn't stay there, couldn't live with the constant presence of her ghost. But no matter how far I go, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that house, she's still with me. Because that's the thing about grief. It doesn't just haunt you, it consumes you. And no matter how far you run, you can't escape it. You can't escape her. Even after moving out of the house, I couldn't escape her presence. I left behind everything, the furniture, the pictures, even the stupid little trinkets she used to collect. I just packed what I could carry and left. But that didn't matter. She came with me, or maybe I never really left her behind. The first night in my new apartment was the worst. I was exhausted, mentally and physically. I hadn't slept properly in weeks, but the moment I closed my eyes, she was there, in the corner of my room, standing perfectly still. It was like she had never left. Her eyes, still dark and hollow, stared at me from across the room. I didn't even bother turning the lights on. I knew she wasn't real, at least not in the way we think of ghosts being real. But she felt real. Her presence, that cold, suffocating weight in the air, was unbearable. I slept with the lights on that night. Not that it helped much. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel her watching me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that she was standing over me, just out of my line of sight, waiting for me to acknowledge her. It was like she wanted me to see her, to really see her, as if that would somehow make it all stop. But it didn't. The following weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and half-remembered dreams. Or maybe they weren't dreams at all. Maybe they were something else, something worse. It started with the phone calls. At first I thought they were just prank calls or wrong numbers. The phone would ring at odd hours late at night or early in the morning when no one should be calling. I'd pick up, but there was never anyone on the other end, just silence. But not the kind of silence you expect. It was the kind of silence that hums in your ears like static. Like someone was listening, waiting for me to speak. Then, one night, I heard it, her voice. "Come home." It was barely a whisper, almost drowned out by the static, but I knew it was her. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely think. I sat there for hours just staring at it, waiting for it to ring again. But it didn't, at least not that night. I thought maybe I was losing my mind, that the stress of everything was finally catching up to me. I stopped going to work, stopped answering calls from friends. I just sat in that apartment waiting for something to happen, waiting for her to come back. It didn't take long for her to show up again. I was lying in bed one night, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to sleep, when I felt that cold, oppressive feeling that always accompanied her presence. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, frozen, as the air around me grew colder and heavier. And then I heard her laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh I remembered. It wasn't soft or warm, like when she used to laugh at something silly I'd said as a kid. No, this laugh was different. It was guttural, almost inhuman, like it was being forced through her throat. It echoed around the room, bouncing off the walls, until it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed and ran to the living room, flipping every light switch on as I went. But no matter how bright the room got, I could still feel her. She was there, just beyond the reach of the light, waiting for me. The next morning, I called a therapist. I didn't tell them everything, just that I'd been having trouble sleeping, that I'd been seeing things that weren't there. They prescribed me sleeping pills and told me to try to relax, to focus on my breathing. They had no idea what was really happening. How could they? That night, I took the pills and managed to sleep for the first time in weeks. It wasn't peaceful, but at least I didn't see her. For a while, things seemed to get better. I convinced myself that maybe it really was all in my head, that the pills were helping, that I was finally moving on. But then the dreams started. In the dreams, it was always the same. I was back in her house, standing in the hallway outside her bedroom. The door was closed, but I could hear her inside, humming softly to herself. It was a lullaby she used to sing to me when I was little, a simple, repetitive tune that should have been comforting. But in the dream, it was anything but. I'd reach for the doorknob, my hand shaking, and as soon as I touched it, the humming would stop. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a weight. I'd stand there, frozen, unable to open the door, knowing that whatever was on the other side wasn't her. Not really. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The dreams were so vivid, so real, that I could still hear the humming long after I was awake. It would echo in my head, that same haunting tune, over and over again, until I couldn't take it anymore. One night, after waking from another dream, I decided I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped between the living and the dead, haunted by a ghost that wasn't my mom. I had to know the truth. I had to go back. I don't know what I expected to find when I returned to the house. Maybe some kind of closure, some final piece of the puzzle that would explain everything. But as soon as I stepped through the front door, I knew I'd made a mistake. The house was exactly as I'd left it, but it felt different. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of her perfume was stronger than ever, clinging to every surface like a sickness. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. Every shadow seemed to shift and move just out of my line of sight. I stopped at the door to her bedroom, the same door from my dreams. It was closed, just like in the dreams, and I could feel that same oppressive weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The moment I touched it, the humming started. Soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. It was the same lullaby, the same tune that had haunted my dreams for weeks. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, unsure if I could go through with it. But I had to. I had to know. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, blocking out the light, but even in the dimness I could see her. She was standing by the window, her back to me, just like in the dreams. Her hair was matted and tangled, her robe hanging loosely off her thin frame. Mom, my voice was barely a whisper, but she didn't move. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Mom, is that you? Slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes were hollow, just like before, empty black pits that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth twisted into that same grotesque smile, her lips curling up in a way that wasn't human. I stumbled back, my heart racing. What? What are you? She didn't answer. Instead, she took a step toward me, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was savoring every second. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. And then she spoke. Come home. Her voice was low and distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep within her. I could barely understand the words, but I knew what she meant. She wasn't asking. She was commanding. Come home. I ran. I don't know how I made it out of the house, but somehow I did. I didn't stop running until I reached the car, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I haven't been back since. I can't. I won't. But even now, even after everything, I still feel her. She's still with me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to return. I hear her voice in the middle of the night, whispering in the darkness. Come home. And I know deep down that one day I will. Because you can't escape the dead. Not when they're your own blood. Not when they're your mother. I never used to dream, or if I did, I couldn't remember them. You know how some people claim they dream every night, how they can recall vivid, bizarre details from their sleep? I wasn't one of them. My nights were always empty, a blank void where time slipped away, leaving me to wake up refreshed and unaware of anything that might have happened in my unconscious mind. But that changed about 3 months ago. The first dream wasn't anything special, at least not at first. It started out as a scene in the desert. I remember the dry heat and the way the sun felt like it was searing my skin, even though I was asleep. I could feel the sand beneath my bare feet, each grain rough and irritating as if they were grinding against the soles of my feet. In the distance, I saw a man. He was sitting on a large rock, dressed in what looked like ancient, tattered robes. His skin was burned from the sun and his lips were cracked and bleeding. He didn't look at me at first. Instead, he stared out at the horizon, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world pressed down on him. Then he turned to me, and that's when everything changed. His eyes, they were full of pain, of anger, and something deeper, something terrifying. He stared into me like he knew me, like he'd been waiting for me all his life. And then he spoke, his voice cracked and hoarse, but clear enough for me to hear every word. I died here, he said, his voice a rasp that sent shivers down my spine despite the heat. I died under this sky, my body left to rot, picked clean by vultures, bones bleached by the sun. And it's because of you. I remember feeling a wave of confusion and fear. What do you mean? I asked, though in the dream, my voice barely felt like it belonged to me. You did this, he repeated, his eyes narrowing, his voice thick with accusation. You left me here to die? You condemned me. I wanted to argue, to tell him that I didn't know him, that I had nothing to do with whatever fate had befallen him, but my mouth wouldn't move. My words wouldn't come. I just stood there, staring at him, feeling the weight of his blame pressing down on me. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I chalked it up to a bad dream, a fluke, maybe something I'd seen in a movie or a show before bed. But it stuck with me, that image of him sitting there, baking in the sun, blaming me for his death. Then the second dream was different, but no less disturbing. This time I was standing in a dense forest. The air was thick and humid, the kind that clings to your skin and makes it hard to breathe. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted and gnarled, blocking out most of the light. I could hear birds calling in the distance, but there was something wrong with their calls. They sounded distorted, off pitch, like someone was trying to mimic them but failing. I walked deeper into the forest, the undergrowth crunching under my feet, and then I lay feet, and that's when I saw him. A man hanging from a tree by his neck, his face swollen and purple, his eyes bulging out of his skull. He was dressed in what looked like medieval clothing, a simple tunic and trousers, his hands bound behind his back. At first I thought he was dead. I mean, he had to be, right? No one could survive that. But then his eyes moved, locking onto mine. I froze, my body paralyzed by fear as his bloated lips twitched into a grotesque smile. You did this, he croaked, his voice barely a whisper, but it echoed in my head, louder and louder until it drowned out the sound of the forest around us. He put me here. He tied the noose. I shook my head, trying to deny it, but I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my throat tight, and all I could do was stand there as a body swayed in the breeze, the rope creaking with every movement. I was innocent, he continued, his voice filled with rage. I didn't deserve this. You took my life for nothing. I tried to wake up. I tried to pull myself out of the dream, to shake off the terror that gripped me, but I couldn't. I was trapped, forced to listen to him, to watch as his body twisted in the wind, his lifeless eyes boring into mine. When I finally woke up, my heart was racing, my sheets soaked with sweat. The image of that man hanging from the tree haunted me for days. But the worst part, deep down, I started to believe him. I couldn't explain it, but there was something in the way he looked at me, something in the certainty of his accusation that made me question if it was true. Had I done something to him? Was this a memory somehow? Or just my mind playing tricks on me? The dreams kept coming. Night after night, I found myself in different places, ancient battlefields, crumbling ruins, desolate villages, and in each one, there was someone waiting for me. A woman who had been stoned to death, her face battered and bruised, accusing me of casting the first stone. A soldier whose throat had been slit in his sleep, his blood staining the ground as he cursed my name. A child no older than 10 who had been drowned in a river, her small, bloated body floating in the water as she stared up at me with hollow, accusing eyes. Every night it was the same. They would explain their deaths in vivid detail, recounting the agony, the fear, the betrayal they felt in their final moments, and every single one of them blamed me. You did this, they would say over and over again, their voices filled with pain and fury. You caused my death. And I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it was just mind-playing tricks on me, that I hadn't caused any of them these deaths, because they happened to string up in base and stibeo. The dreams were so real, so visceral, that I started to doubt myself. Maybe it was some kind of karmic punishment, some cosmic retribution for sins I couldn't remember. Or maybe these weren't dreams at all. Maybe they were memories of past lives where I had done terrible things. But I started to dread going to sleep. I would stay up as late as I could, drinking coffee, taking stimulants, doing anything to keep myself awake. But it didn't matter. Eventually I would have to sleep, and when I did, they were waiting for me. One night, I found myself in what looked like an ancient temple, the walls lined with flickering torches that cast eerie shadows on the stone. The air was thick with the smell of incense, and the sound of chanting echoed off the walls. In the center of the room, a man knelt before a stone altar, his body covered in ritualistic scars. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and anger. You sacrificed me, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. You brought me here, bound me to this altar, and offered me up to the gods. And for what? For power? For wealth? I wanted to scream, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. I stood there, frozen, as he recounted every detail of his death, how I had held the knife, how I had whispered the incantation, how I had driven the blade into his chest, and watched as the life drained out of him. You condemned me to this fate, he said, his voice growing louder, more accusatory. And now, you will suffer as I did. I woke up screaming, my heart pounding in my chest. The dreams were getting worse, more vivid, more personal. It was as if they were trying to break me, to make me confess to something I didn't even know I had done. I stopped leaving the house. I couldn't face the outside world, not when I felt like I was being haunted by the ghosts of people I had supposedly killed thousands of years ago. I barely ate, barely slept, just sitting in my apartment, waiting for the next dream, the next accusation. And then one night it changed. I found myself in a dark, empty void. There were no ancient ruins, no victims waiting to confront me. Just darkness. I stood there confused, waiting for something to happen, and then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was me. Or at least it looked like me, but there was something off about him. His eyes were cold, emotionless, and his skin was pale and sickly. He stared at me for a long moment before he spoke. You did this, he said, his voice a hollow echo of my own. All of it. I shook my head, backing away. No, I didn't. I didn't do anything. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. You did. You've always done it. In every life and every time. You've been the cause of their suffering, their pain. And now it's time for you to pay. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was trapped, rooted to the spot as he reached out, his hand cold and clammy as it wrapped around my throat. You can't escape this, he whispered, his breath cold against my skin. You will suffer just like they did, and it's all your fault. I woke up gasping for air, my heart racing, my body trembling. The dreams hadn't stopped. If anything, they were only getting worse. And now I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I deserved it. I wish I could say that waking up brought some form of relief, but the terror of the dreams clung to me long after my eyes snapped open. It wasn't just the adrenaline anymore. that heart-pounding fear that something from the dream had followed me into the real world. It was the weight of the accusations, thousands of years of guilt and pain that I was somehow responsible for. My mind couldn't shake it. Every time I closed my eyes, even for a moment, I could see their faces, twisted in agony, demanding justice. And now, I wasn't sure where the dream stopped and where my life began. That day after the dream with myself, I didn't leave my apartment. I didn't even get out of bed for hours. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling like the walls were closing in. My chest was tight, and it was getting harder and harder to breathe. Maybe it was the lack of sleep catching up with me, or maybe it was something else, something darker. When I finally forced myself up, I stumbled into the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, trying to ground myself. I looked in the mirror, and for a split second, I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. My face was pale, gaunt, dark circles heavy under my eyes, my skin stretched thin like I hadn't seen the sun in weeks. I was looking at a version of myself that I didn't recognize, one that hadn't existed 3 months ago. I stared at my reflection, waiting for it to blink, waiting for it to accuse me again. But it didn't. For now. By the time night rolled around, I was terrified of falling asleep. I'd done everything I could to keep myself awake: coffee, energy drinks, hell, even slapping myself to stay alert. But no matter how hard I fought it, my body was exhausted. It was like fighting a losing battle. Eventually, my mind and body would cave in. And when they did, I knew exactly what was waiting for me on the other side. It was only a matter of time. And then it happened. I was back in the middle of the desert, the same one from the first dream, but this time the air was colder. The sun was still hanging low in the sky, but there was an icy breeze cutting through the heat. The man on the rock was gone, but the desolation was the same, the sand stretching endlessly in all directions, a barren wasteland of nothingness. I was alone. Or so I thought. I started walking, my feet sinking into the sand with every step. I don't know why I was moving, where I thought I was going. It's not like there was anywhere to go in this place, but something compelled me to keep walking. The silence pressed in around me, thick and suffocating, the only sound my footsteps crunching through the grains of sand. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the setting sun. But then I saw it again, something shifting just beyond the horizon. I stopped. A figure was approaching slowly, methodically, its steps deliberate and unhurried. I couldn't make out any details at first, just the vague shape of a person moving through the endless expanse of desert. But as it got closer, I realized something was wrong. Its body was twisted, unnatural, its limbs too long, its posture hunched. Its head hung low, as if it couldn't hold itself up, and its arms dangled awkwardly at its sides. But it wasn't the physical deformities that struck me, it was the aura of pure, unfiltered malice radiating off of it. The closer it got, the more I could feel it. It was like the air around me was thickening, heavy with anger and suffering. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest, but the figure kept coming. There was no stopping it, no avoiding it. When it finally reached me, I saw its face, or what was left of it. The skin was charred, burnt away in places, revealing bone underneath. Its lips were twisted into a snarl, its eyes wide and crazed, filled with rage and hatred. There was no doubt in my mind that this person had died in agony. The stench of burnt flesh hung heavy in the air, and I could feel the heat radiating from its body. "You did this," it rasped, its voice barely more than a whisper, but it echoed through the desert like a thunderclap. "You killed me." I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "No, I didn't. I didn't do anything," I choked out, my voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, its charred hand reaching out towards me. "You burned me alive," it hissed, its fingers brushing against my chest. "You watched as the flames consumed me, and you did nothing. You let me die." The touch was like fire, searing pain spreading through my body from where its hand had made contact. I tried to scream, but my throat was tight, my breath caught in my chest. I felt like I was burning from the inside out, my skin blistering, my lungs filling with smoke. "You deserve this," the figure said, its voice filled with venom. "You deserve to burn." I fell to my knees, gasping for air, my vision blurring as the pain overwhelmed me. My skin felt like it was melting, the heat unbearable, and I could hear the crackling of flames all around me. I woke up screaming, the taste of ash still lingering in my mouth. The days that followed were a blur. I barely left my bed. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the charred figure, heard its accusations. I felt the fire licking at my skin, the heat suffocating me. I could still hear its voice in my head, repeating the same words over and over again. You did this. You killed me. It was getting harder and harder to distinguish the dreams from reality. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of them figures standing in the corner of my room, watching me with hollow, accusing eyes. I'd blink and they'd be gone, but the fear never left. And the guilt. It was always there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, whispering in the back of my thoughts. Maybe I had done something. Maybe I was responsible. Maybe all of these people, these victims, had been waiting for me all this time. But why me? Why now? I couldn't remember doing anything to deserve this. I'd never killed anyone, never even hurt anyone intentionally. But that didn't seem to matter. In their eyes, I was guilty, and there was no escaping it. One night, as I lay in bed, too afraid to sleep but too exhausted to stay awake, I heard a voice. It was soft at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder, more insistent. You can't run from this, it said. I sat up, my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was dark, but I could feel a presence, something lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. You can't hide. The voice was closer now, right next to my ear, and I felt a cold breath against my skin. I turned, my eyes searching the darkness, but there was no one there. Face us, the voice said, and this time it was different. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping, blending together in a cacophony of accusations and pain. You caused this. You condemned us. You will pay. I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, but the voices didn't stop. They were inside my head now, clawing at my thoughts, ripping apart my sanity piece by piece. I screamed, but no sound came out. And then I saw them. They were everywhere, standing at the foot of my bed, crowding the corners of the room, their twisted, mangled bodies bathed in the pale light of the moon, filtering through the window. Burned, drowned, hanged, stoned, stabbed. Each one a different horror, a different death. And they were all staring at me with the same expression: hatred. You did this. I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt, the fear, the overwhelming sense of dread, it was too much. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a lamp, and hurled it across the room, smashing it against the wall. But they didn't move. They just stood there, watching, waiting. And then, as one, they stepped forward. I haven't slept in days. I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. Every time I drift off, I'm back in their world, their hell, where they remind me of every unspeakable horror that I somehow caused. They tell me their stories, show me their deaths in agonizing detail, and they blame me for all of it. I don't know how much longer I can take this. Maybe they're right. Maybe I did do something unforgivable. Maybe this is my punishment, and there's no escaping it. All I know is, I'm running out of time.